Welcome to another episode of Poetic Lines. As we begin a new year, many people are cautiously hopeful and focused on personal growth. My guest today, James Cruz, believes poetry can facilitate that process by offering a gateway to kindness, gratitude, wonder, and joy. Tools for slowing down and reflecting in a sped-up world. James has spotlighted the healing power of poetry since 2019 when he edited the anthology Healing the Divide, Poems of Kindness and Connection. Since then, he has curated three best-selling anthologies: How to Love the World, Poems of Gratitude and Hope, The Path to Kindness, Poems of Connection and Joy, and The Wonder of Small Things, Poems of Peace and Renewal. Those three books are now available in a box set. James has also published a book of essays and 6 collections of poetry. James earned a PhD in literature and creative writing from University of Nebraska-Lincoln and has taught at several universities. For the past few years, he has spoken in various settings and has led workshops on kindness, mindfulness, and writing for self-compassion. I'm delighted to have him here today to talk about his new books and why poetry as a healing force is needed now more than ever. James, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you here again.
It's a thrill to be here with you again, Elizabeth. Thank you so much.
Would you read a poem to get us started?
Absolutely. So, this is a poem from my book, Unlocking the Heart. And this is called Beech Trees in Spring. I want to be like the maples, letting go so easily of their leaves in the slightest autumn breeze, surrendering every piece of themselves they no longer need, and embracing bareness like a new suit they simply step into. But I am more like the beech trees, which cling to the husks of their leaves long into spring, refusing to give up even a scrap of who they once were until the last possible minute. Perhaps they need the reassurance, or maybe they're here to lend music to the silence of winter. Leaves beaten thin as tissue paper, rustling a lonely chorus in the snow-covered woods, until buds push up to the surface, and with no other choice, they say yes to the final scatter and release, learning again as if for the first time how loss leaves room for something new.
That is absolutely gorgeous. And one of the things I like about that poem is that you capture that experience so many people have where we know we should let go of things, and yet somehow we can't quite do it. And if we continue to hold on, then we get to a point where we are sort of nudged or sometimes forced to let go. And then there is an interesting epiphany or revelation. You captured that so beautifully.
Mm. Well, thank you. That's a wonderful distillation of the poem, and I'm so glad that you knew exactly what I was going for there. And it's just true. I mean, I am much more like those beech leaves than like the maples. I hold on to things for much longer than I probably should, like many of us.
Yes, many of us do that, but your poem is reassuring because it suggests that it's okay wherever you are in the journey. It's okay. Just keep moving forward. And that's a message that so many people need.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I love that you're using that phrase moving forward because I think the trees have no other choice but to stay where they are, to stay with what is the season around them and the coldness and the bareness. And, they just are in this cycle. And so many of us are in this cycle too. And I think that the poem is also a call for acceptance and even self-forgiveness that, there are going to be times when we just can't let go or we can't move on to some new place in our lives. And, I'm often turning to the wisdom of my own poems that are coming through in order to understand some of these deeper things.
You're so right about there being a cycle and the fact that forgiveness and self-acceptance needs to be part of that cycle because otherwise it's really hard to move on, especially when there's so much going on in the world. But your poetry gives readers nuggets and gentle hints and epiphanies about how to move forward. That's why your poems resonate with so many people because you understand that process.
Well, I'm really trying to just understand it for myself first. I always think that I'm writing my poems for myself mainly. And then I am very free about sharing them in the hopes that other people glean bits of wisdom, some of those nuggets that you mentioned from the poems for themselves. So I'm just trying to be true to my own experience. And I think, what we find is when we are as authentic to our own experience as we can be, then other people will resonate with that too. They may not have the same approach or the same exact experience, but I think poetry taps into something much wiser and much wider than any of us could do in everyday conversation.
Well, you certainly tap into all of that in your own poems, but also in the work that you have edited. Your anthologies have become bestsellers because they meet a need so many people have to understand part of their journey and to connect with others who are also wondering what it means to try and live with gratitude or with awareness in a world that really doesn't support those efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what initially drove me to begin editing anthologies. I started with a little anthology called Healing the Divide, Poems of Kindness and Connection. And I really put it together for the students that I was teaching at the time, mostly, 18 to 20-year-olds. And, it was right after the 2016 election is when I first began to think about that book. And it just came out from a pretty small Vermont press, and I just thought, wouldn't it be nice if it sold a couple hundred copies? And then it ended up resonating and reaching out much, much farther than I ever would have dreamed. And I think it was because that message of, kindness, connection, and what you mentioned, gratitude, hope, all of these areas that I've trafficked in, that message was much larger than just me as a poet or an editor, but much larger than the individual poets, even that I included. Once you give a vehicle to a larger message that I think a culture and a world really needs, then people get it and it really starts to take off. And I just don't, I think a lot of poems that are shared are sometimes overly obtuse and hard to understand and maybe a little cynical. And so, I wanted to create a space where poetry that was very sincere and heartfelt while still being complex and interesting could kind of find a home and really speak to people.
You certainly have done that beautifully. So, after that anthology was published, what happened next?
Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of surprise that it reached as many people as it did. And then what I realized, and I've written about this a little bit before. So the year after that anthology was published, my husband and I went on a trip to Argentina. We went to Mendoza and a couple of areas in the country. And I was struck by the joy and gratitude and just groundedness of the people that we were encountering there, not really speaking much of the language, not really knowing our way around. And yet there was this sense of welcome from so many people. And it seemed to be missing from our own culture, back here in the US. And so I began to think like, well, what could I capture with poetry? how could I frame an anthology that would capture this in poetry? And so the idea for a new anthology that was centered around gratitude and hope started to be born. And then we came home, and a month later, the COVID-19 pandemic started, and we all needed more gratitude and more hope than ever before. And so, that book really took on a life of its own as I gathered poems from all the people that I knew and reached out to brand new people. And then as I came across a poem by the inaugural poet Amanda Gorman, as I came across a poem by her and decided to include it, I think that just really kind of pushed this book over the top. And once that was published, I think it had an initial press run of maybe 1,000 copies, and the publisher ran out of copies of the book. So, which was completely unexpected. No one had ever expected that to happen with a book of poetry before. And I think it just spoke to this need first for kindness, then for gratitude. And I've just been, continually trying to find what our culture most needs in that moment and trying my best to speak to that through the only mode that I know best, which is poetry and writing. So I have revisited kindness. I have visited wonder and awe with my anthologies, and they still seem to be resonating with people.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that I love about the anthologies is that each one is complete on its own. It gives you a full experience and a wide range of poems that really help you understand different aspects of gratitude or awe. But when you look at the anthologies together, and I know they're available now in a new set, they point to different aspects of the healing process. And by healing, I mean in the broadest possible sense. They help people regain a sense of calm, a sense of hope, a sense of peace. And they work together in such a wonderful way that you can turn to one anthology when you feel that you need gratitude, another anthology when you need a sense of awe, and another when you need to just focus on small moments.
Yeah, you're putting that so well, and I love that you included that word healing in your description of the anthologies, which are now available in a new box set called very simply "Box Full of Poetry," because that was my goal. I started with the anthology "Healing the Divide," and then I realized that the healing that we needed went beyond just needing more kindness and connection. I think we all still need that and we still crave it, especially on the heels of the pandemic and all that is happening in the world still. But I think there are other lenses that we can use to approach that. And you're absolutely right that I tried my best to create self-contained books, where each poem was almost like a stepping stone that led one into the next. And then I also wanted them to represent these different aspects of the human positive emotion spectrum so that when people needed a dose of something, they could go to this particular poem or poet or this anthology and really find it. And so that's why I am excited that they're available as a box set because I always kind of envisioned them as a trilogy. I don't think I was aware that I was, creating a trilogy, especially when I started the first one, but they really do work in that way. And if you actually read them, take the last poem from each one, I realized recently they each kind of point to the next theme that's coming down the pike, which was totally not planned. But it's just something that happens, I think, when you're really engrossed in the creative process and you're allowing these poems, whether it's your own or poems by other people, to really speak to you and allow you to create this thing. At least my intention with the anthologies is really to serve the world. And like I said with my own poems before, to serve myself, in a very selfish way. I made these anthologies because I needed them. I needed to read more about gratitude and hope, kindness, wonder, and awe. I need those daily messages. And so I've discovered that oftentimes what I most need is probably what other people need too.
I love the fact that the last poem in each book kind of points to the next book because the things that you highlight, gratitude, focusing on small moments, those aren't just tools. In many ways, those are forces,
Mm,
and they can help people move forward. They can help people reframe the way they see the world. And when you reframe the way you see things, you reframe how you experience things as well.
mm. Beautifully and wisely said. Absolutely. When you reframe the world, you absolutely reframe your own experiences and your own responses to the world. And I think that's the wonder of what these poems seem to do for me and for other people is that, they reframe the world or maybe even shine a light on some neglected corner of the world, our personal world, and say, oh, wait, wonder is still possible, even in a very dark and difficult time. Or, kindness is a practice. It doesn't just happen spontaneously. And once you read a whole book of poems about kindness and connection, or maybe occasional failures of kindness and connection, then you realize, oh, this is something that takes work. This is something, this is the kind of healing that isn't done with just one simple act. And then it's like, oh, I'm a kind person now. That's it. That it takes the practice of this and the staying in touch with the world over and over again each day. And so I think that's why a lot of folks, when they get a hold of the anthologies, they'll read, one or two poems a day. Or I've had people tell me they read a couple poems before bed. People share one poem a day with their class or their workplace, or, they read a poem before a meal as a way of kind of grounding and saying a little thank you for the meal they're about to share. So there are just all these ways that we can use poetry. And I think that's what I have wanted to point to both with my own poems and the anthologies is that poetry can be a very useful force, to use your word, in our lives. That it's not necessarily just a practice of writing, that it is this mysterious force that I think can reframe our world and our experience and also steer us toward more gratitude, more kindness, and more wonder in everyday life.
What I like about the anthologies is that they are so authentic. They do point to the importance of gratitude or developing your kindness muscle, but they also show that it isn't always easy to stay in a positive mind frame or to remain kind. It is a choice that you have to make over and over, and you do have to develop those skills.
Yeah, and I want to say too, just so folks don't think that it's all positive, all light. I mean, these are very light-filled books, but I was also quite conscious of wanting to include poems of grief and poems of difficulty that give a roadmap to tapping more deeply into those emotions too, because I often think it's not the avoidance of kindness or gratitude or these other positive emotions that is most harmful to us in our emotional lives. It is the avoidance of really difficult things like grief or pushing away our despair or distracting ourselves from the pain of losing something or someone. Those are the things that can take us away from those other positive qualities, because if we are pushing away one emotion, then we're often going to be pushing away all emotions at the same time, not able to kind of surrender more deeply into any of them. And so, a poem like Naomi Shihab Nye's Kindness, for instance, which talks about how kindness is always with us, but sorrow is the other side of that kindness. And until we know sorrow as the deepest thing, she says, we're not actually going to be able to know kindness as the other side of that.
You're right that it's important to not shy away from grief. It's important not to shy away from the difficult emotions. I think many times we do shy away from those feelings because we're not sure how to deal with them. And we're not sure that if we give ourselves over to those emotions, that we'll be able to pull back and still have the kindness or the positive view that we would like to on a daily basis. That's why the anthologies are so helpful because they show you then go into those dark places and you can emerge once you have experienced what you need to feel and maybe what you need to let go of.
That's right. Absolutely. And I think, it's the same as listening to a piece of music that brings us to tears mysteriously, allows us to touch in on grief, or looking at a painting, watching a movie, reading a book that really takes us to that place. Sometimes we can't quite get to that place of surrender on our own. And we need a poem, we need something else that speaks very deeply to the experience of sorrow, despair, and maybe shows us how to either stay with that if that's what we need, or to come out of that if that's what we need in a particular moment. So I always appreciate poems that are much more complex and that, start in a place maybe of difficulty or grief, but almost lead us with each word like a breadcrumb out of that experience, even if it's just a moment of relief. That's often where my own poems begin, is with, struggling and in a dark spot. And then the more that I'm paying attention to that feeling, the more that I start to open up to my world and find that it's not quite as dark as I thought it was, or there's this thing that I can give my attention to instead of the sadness inside. So I think oftentimes our minds need some sort of external object to focus on so that we're not as caught in the emotion itself. And I think poems show us how to do that, how to look for, people now call them glimmers, how to look for these things that can call us out of a tight spot and back into ourselves and the world. What some people might call mindfulness, just becoming really present to where we are.
I love that idea of glimmers. That is so evocative and so visual, and it describes perfectly what it is that people do need when you're trying to come out of a dark place, because sometimes you don't know how to work your way through it. But as you said, the poems can give you something to focus on. They can become an anchor as you move through the darkness.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I love that image of a poetry being an anchor, because I often think that whether I'm writing a poem or reading a poem, it just anchors me more deeply in the lived experience of everyday life. And like, I was just reading the poem about the beach leaves in spring, and on a walk yesterday, I noticed those beech leaves still clinging to the trees in the winter woods, and heard that slight rustle and thought about that poem. So, I think it's also, whether we're writing our own or reading a poem by someone else, we anchor ourselves in that experience, in that wisdom that we can glean from that experience, so that we do build up that muscle, like you were talking about before, so that we have greater access to it.
Would you read a poem from one of the anthologies?
So I'll read one of the poems, The Wonder of Small Things, which is my most recent anthology. And this one is by January Gill O'Neill, and it's called How to Love. And I think this one is perfect for our conversation, because it really is about re entering the world after a hard time and reawakening to what's around us. So this is How to Love. After stepping into the world again, there is that question of how to love, how to bundle yourself against the frosted morning, the crunch of icy grass underfoot, the scrape of cold wipers along the windshield and convert time into distance. What song to sing down an empty road as you begin your morning commute? And is there enough in you to see, really see, the three wild turkeys crossing the street with their featherless heads and stilt-like legs in search of a morning meal? Nothing to do but hunker down, wait for them to safely cross. As they amble away, you wonder if they want to be startled back into this world. Maybe you do too, waiting for all this to give way to love itself, to look into the eyes of another and feel something. The pleasure of a new lover in the unbroken night, your wings folded around him on the other side of this ragged January, as if a long sleep has ended.
That is such a gorgeous poem. A couple of lines that stood out to me were when she describes the turkeys and do they want to be startled out of this experience, and then the idea of waking up after a long sleep. Poetry puts so much into so few lines. It captures a moment, but it takes you beyond the moment and it puts you in a place where you can experience wisdom, you can experience a depth of emotion that you can't really explain.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the way the poet seems to be talking to herself, doing that bit of self-inquiry. Do the turkeys feel like this too? Do they want to be startled out of this moment back into the world?
Mhm.
Asking those really important questions, and yet it's just part of the morning commute. It's nothing special. And she is in a moment that she's maybe come back to the world. She's turning outward and saying, what do you have to teach me? What lessons are available in this very ordinary, very simple moment along my morning commute? And I think a poem like this and so many of the poems that I love and collect together, they invite us to do this for ourselves, whether we are poets or not. They invite us to look outward. What do you see? What do you feel? What do you imagine about these three, turkeys with their featherless heads crossing the road that you have to wait for, hunker down and wait for? So it's just amazing to me, these small moments that can contain so much wisdom about how to live a life.
If you enjoyed the conversation so far, check back next month for part 2 of my interview with poet and editor James Cruz. I know you'll enjoy his insights and poems.